Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Let's welcome our first guest. A real pleasure to welcome him back. It's been a while since he last joined us. He's a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and the co-founder of Reaganomics. Now, check him out at paulcraigroberts.org. That's his website. He's a prolific writer, terrific articles, great insight into what's going on geopolitically right now. As it happens, updates every couple of hours. Check out paulcraigroberts.org. You can regularly see him on TV, on RT and Press TV and elsewhere. And Mr. Roberts, by the way, happy Thanksgiving and thanks for stepping away from the turkey to talk to us today. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. I'm pleased to speak with you again, Richie.
Paul, thanks very much. Just before we talk about the downing of the Russian plane, let's talk about what you will probably be getting now on your mainstream news channels there in the US, and that is that it's looking very like David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, is going to secure enough votes from the British Parliament to join the bombing spree in Syria. You will probably be aware that he addressed Parliament today, laying out the reasons why he thinks it's a good idea to get involved. The leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, asked some pretty fair, I wouldn't say tough, but fair questions to Cameron about what would happen afterwards. And later on today then, Corbyn wrote to his Labour colleagues, his Labour MPs, and said that he couldn't, in any conscience, vote in favour of the bombing. But it looks like no matter what, David Cameron is going to get those votes next week, Paul, to join in the bombing spree. What's your reaction to that?
Well, Richie, I haven't paid any attention to it. Which side is Cameron bombing on, Washington's or the French and the Russian side?
Well, going with the United States, the French and the Turks, apparently.
Well, my understanding was the French wanted to join up with the Russians and bomb ISIS.
Isn't that interesting? Because as you and I talk, sorry to interrupt you, as you and I talk, yes, it was announced late this afternoon that Russian officials are in Paris this afternoon talking to the French about a strategy going forward. That is very interesting.
Well, it looks like there would be two different coalitions. If the French go along with the Russians and vice versa, and they're bombing ISIS. But Washington has been, until the Paris attacks, very protective of ISIS. Indeed, it's a Washington creation. Washington created it. This has been admitted on television by the former director of the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, who says flat out, yes, we created ISIS. So it's kind of hard in Washington, of course, is using ISIS to try to overthrow Assad. So it's hard to see how Washington's agenda can coincide with Russia's. And it's hard to see how France's agenda, if they actually believe ISIS was responsible for the Paris attacks, it's hard to see how France could go along with Washington. And so we see here some potential breakup in NATO, which would be a good thing. We also see strains on NATO from the Turkish, shooting down the Russian military plane and lying about it and not giving a believable explanation, and being reprimanded by the Vice Chancellor of Germany, who stated publicly that the unstable element was not Putin, it was the president of Turkey. And we've seen a lot of distancing of other NATO countries from Turkey, making it clear they have no intention of going to war with Russia in order to defend Turkey's right to shoot down a plane and lie about it. So I think these are all stresses on NATO. It must worry Washington a great deal. And of course, the British Prime Minister for the longest time has been a Washington stooge. He answers to Washington. He doesn't answer to the British people. So I'm not surprised that Cameron would desert the French and line up with Washington. That's just normal behavior for the British. They always line up with Washington.
Let me ask you this. You talked about the Turks shooting down that Russian plane. Did they do that of their own volition, Paul, or were they encouraged to do it from outside of Turkey?
You know, we don't know at this time. There are three explanations. I can tell you what they are. The neoconservative explanation, for example, being laid down by my former newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, is that, see, this proves that Putin is a paper tiger. Even Turkey can shoot down a Russian plane. He doesn't do anything about it. And so the Europeans don't have to worry about sending troops to Ukraine. He's not going to do anything about it. We can put more bases on his border. He's not going to do anything about it. This is the neocons are using this to claim that, see, Putin just accepted he's weak. He can't do anything. And so we can go ahead and push harder. So the neoconservatives are using it to try to build up more aggression from NATO toward Russia. That's one explanation. And of course, that's whether they were involved in it, I don't know, but Victoria Nuland, I think, was recently in Turkey. And she's the one who stirs up a lot of this stuff. So another explanation is that, the Turkish president is just another gangster, some billionaire oligarch. And the Turks were buying all of the oil from ISIS. And it was a very profitable business for them. And the money was flowing into the president of Turkey's pocket or that of his family, his son. And he got very angry that the Russians busted that up. You know, the Russians blew up a large number of the oil tankers that were lined up with the oil to go into Turkey. And so his huge fortune is impacted by this. And so one explanation is that he simply lost it. He lost control. He's not a guy who is very much in control. He's not, deliberative. And that he decided that he was protected by NATO and that Russia wouldn't do anything because Turkey could invoke Article 5 of NATO and present Russia with all of the European countries, the United States. And so that's the second explanation. The third explanation is given to me by a former Air Force intelligence officer, and he says that there's another possible explanation. Apparently, the Russians have a new kind of technology that allows them to shut down all of our communication systems. My friend, the Air Force intelligence officer, says that when the Russians first went into Syria, they announced what their area of air operations was and informed everybody to stay out of it. And an hour before the first sortie that they launched, they gave notice to the Americans and Israelis. And as the sortie began, they used this technology and shut down the entire communication systems of the United States and Israel in the area. Everything went blind, even the satellites. And this has terrified the Americans. Because it means they would have no control over any battle, whether air, sea, or land.
And it comes as well, Paul. It comes at a time when...
Let me finish this.
Sorry, go ahead.
And then, according to my friend, they used it one other occasion, maybe a week later. The two Israeli American jets, F-15s or 16s, flew into the area that the Russians had told everybody to stay out of. And the Russians informed them that they were in this prescribed area, and the Israelis didn't respond. And the Russians used this technology a second time and shut down all the fire control systems, all the communication systems of the Israeli planes. Left them totally blind. They couldn't even talk to each other. They couldn't reach their base. Their operational weapon systems wouldn't work. And then the Russians reached them over just the AM system that the civilian pilots used and told them, okay, get out now. And they turned tail and fled, and they haven't been back. Well, this, my friend says, this has the Americans beside themselves. They've sent every resource they have in Air Force intelligence, code breakers, all of that, to Syria, and they're hoping that the Turks, having shot down the plane, will encourage the Russians to use this technology much more often. And the more often it's used, the more they can monitor it, look for its weaknesses, or look for how to break the code or duplicate it. And so that's a third reason that he says that this was, he doesn't know this, but he says this is one of the reasons that this is what would explain why the United States and Turkey would take such an extreme risk at shooting down a Russian military aircraft over Syria.
Is he reliable, Paul? Is he the sort of guy that when he comes up with this sort of intelligence, is it usually right?
Well, he's reliable in the sense that he's experienced and highly intelligent. And he's not saying that he knows this.
Yeah, he's just heard it.
That he's saying this, he just knows from his own experience that this means, we are like a banana republic right now, facing Genghis Khan or something, you see, because we have no protection against this. So it means if we tried to go into combat, they can shut down our Navy, they can shut down our Air Force, they can shut down our armies, and we've got nothing to do about it. And so this leaves us helpless. I had heard myself earlier that the Russians had used this technology on the missile cruiser that we had sent to set off their Black Sea port in Crimea. And they had one plane fly over and the whole ship's shut down.
The ship went black, is that right? It went into complete silence, radio silence.
And it scared the crew to death. And so they have this ability to make everything a total sitting duck. And so I think his explanation makes a hell of a lot of sense. I mean, if this I don't know they use this technology, but there have been these reports. I've seen them. You don't know if they're right or wrong, and the Western media is so useless, they won't investigate. You can't trust the Western media anymore. In fact, they won't even report it because they don't want anybody to know that we're not number one or something, you see. So it's hard to really know, but that makes a lot of sense to me as well. I had a lot to do for a while with security matters, and I can see that this would be a fundamental challenge. It would, you would feel like you had bows and arrows against people with nuclear weapons.
You must mention, Paul, I must mention what Paul said there. Paul's been a bit modest. This isn't a conspiracy theorist making the claims. This is Paul Craig Roberts, folks. He's a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He's a remarkable journalist, accredited journalist, and these are scary times. And if Russia is in possession of a weapon like that, because it is a weapon, let's be honest about it, a jamming weapon that's so good that it can wipe out, even technically advanced countries like the United States and Britain, well, they'd have very good reason to be scared of that. So